When you look back at the ruins of an ancient civilization, whether it's the Roman Empire or, the Maya or the Bronze Age collapse, you naturally look for the catastrophe.
Right, you look for the earthquake or the volcanic eruption.
Exactly. You look for the multi-decade drought or the barbarian or horde breaching the city gates. We have this really deep-seated expectation that a civilizational failure must be a dramatic, highly visible engineering fail.
Oh, absolutely. You want to be able to point at the rubble, circle a date on the calendar, and say, right there, that's the day the empire fell.
Yeah.
It's actually a comforting narrative in a sort of dark way. We desperately want collapse to be an acute injury, like a sudden explosion.
Because we can see it.
Right, because if collapse is an acute, visible event, it means we can see it coming. It means we can, build a wall or invent a new technology or win a battle to stop it.
Yeah.
It gives us this illusion of control.
Well, right, but what if the thing that actually kills a civilization isn't a disaster at all? What if it's the exact opposite? And that is the premise we are exploring for you today on this deep dive. What if extreme safety, intense compassion, and the systematic elimination of all risk are actually thermodynamic death sentences for a society?
It's a heavy question.
It really is. What if the ideas we've been taught to view as the absolute pinnacle of human moral progress are the exact mechanisms driving an invisible terminal decline?
And see, that is where you leave the comfort of traditional history and step into the much murkier waters of complex systems theory and, well, civilizational thermodynamics.
Right.
Because in that framework, the most dangerous failures aren't sudden at all.
Yeah.
They're slow, they're incredibly comfortable, and they almost always feel like righteous progress right up until the system quietly runs out of energy.
So we are unpacking a truly massive, paradigm-shifting collection of essays today. The core thesis is that a single, cohesive worldview hijacked Western civilization in a remarkably short window, roughly between 1966 and 1976.
A very specific decade.
Very specific. And the author refers to this worldview as the tyranny of the present. Now, before we get into the mechanics of this, I want to establish some guardrails for you listening.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Right. So this material pulls from sweeping civilizational analysis, evolutionary biology, game theory, and it applies them to highly charged philosophical topics.
Very highly charged.
Yeah. The author deconstructs frameworks that are foundational to the modern political left and critiques core assumptions held by the political right.
It spares no one.
Exactly. So we are going to look at these purely as mechanical frameworks. We aren't here to advocate for a political platform. We're just here to impartially audit the physics of these ideas.
Just the physics.
Right. We want to understand how a desire for present-day comfort might have accidentally programmed our society to consume its own future.
So to do that, we have to start by defining the central target of this entire 1970s philosophical revolution, the thing that this new worldview sought to eradicate.
Okay.
And that concept is variance.
Variance, so differences. Inequality of outcomes, capabilities, cultures, even genetics.
Exactly.
The text argues that in this crucial decade, Western thought fundamentally shifted to view variance as a pathology, like a disease that a moral society is obligated to cure.
Yes. And this is where the thermodynamic and biological perspective becomes absolutely crucial to understand. Let's just look at the physics of complex adaptive systems for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
In any complex system, whether it's an ecosystem, an economy, a species, variance is not a bug. It is a mandatory, non-negotiable feature of survival.
Because it drives adaptation.
Exactly. Variance is the raw material of evolution. Imagine a population of organisms that are entirely 100% genetically identical. There is zero variance.
Like clones.
Right. They might be perfectly, beautifully optimized for today's specific temperature, today's rainfall, today's predators. They might look incredibly successful right now.
But the environment is never static. It's always changing.
Precisely. If the climate shifts by 2 degrees tomorrow, or say a novel virus is introduced into the ecosystem, the entire population goes completely extinct.
Because they have no defense.
Right, because they lack the genetic diversity to explore new survival strategies. Some portion of a population needs to have a weird mutation, a different capability, a strange adaptation that might actually be useless or even mildly detrimental today.
But it becomes the key to survival tomorrow.
Exactly. Variance is how a biological or social system maps the realm of the possible. Without it, you just lose the capacity to adapt to unpredictable environmental shocks. You lose resilience.
You know, it makes me think of modern agriculture, actually. like the Gros Michel banana.
Oh, that's a great example.
Yeah, so in the early 20th century, basically every banana exported to the West was this one specific clone. It was a perfect monoculture, zero variance.
Highly efficient.
Super highly profitable. It was consistent. It was easy to ship. And then Panama disease hit in the 1950s. And because every single plant was genetically identical, the fungus nearly wiped the entire global industry off the map in a matter of years.
Wow.
Yeah, they had to completely switch to a new variety, the Cavendish, which is what we eat today.
That is the perfect biological analogy. A monoculture is highly efficient in the short term, but incredibly fragile over the long term.
So to apply that to human civilization, the argument is that treating variance as a disease it's basically like trying to turn a wild, diverse ecosystem into a perfectly manicured golf course.
Yeah, the golf course.
Right, a golf course looks incredibly fair. It is uniform.
Yes.
Every blade of grass is exactly the same height. It's very pleasant to walk on, but it is fundamentally artificial.
And, crucially for our discussion, think about the energy required to maintain that golf course.
yeah.
A wild ecosystem maintains itself. It has friction, it has predators, it has death, but it is self-sustaining. A golf course requires massive, continuous inputs of external energy to fight off the natural tendency toward variance.
You need daily mowing.
Mowing, chemical fertilizers, herbicides to kill the weeds, automated irrigation.
Right.
If you stop applying that massive energy input for even a few weeks, the variance returns. The weeds grow back, the grass gets patchy.
So in the language of the source text, demanding the eradication of variance forces a society to shift all of its energy away from what it calls metamorphosis, which is creation, growth, and pushing boundaries into homeostasis, which is just maintenance and distribution.
Yes, if a civilization fundamentally comes to believe that the system has already generated enough wealth, enough knowledge, and enough safety to last forever,
Then what's left to do?
right, the only moral imperative left is to smooth out the differences. You
Right.
stop trying to grow the pie. You stop exploring. Instead, you build a massive bureaucracy, a massive enforcement mechanism to ensure that every single slice of the pie is identical down to the millimeter.
You become obsessed with the golf course.
You become obsessed with the golf course.
I hear that and, part of me thinks, well, yeah, that sounds incredibly compassionate.
Yeah.
When you look at the human equivalent of the golf course, you're looking at a society trying to ensure no one is left behind. You're trying to eliminate poverty, eliminate suffering. It feels inherently righteous.
It does feel righteous, and that is exactly why it was so easily adopted. But the thermodynamic audit says that underneath that compassion, you are actively destroying the system's ability to survive tomorrow.
Because you're burning all your energy.
You are burning your stored energy to fight the very mechanism variance that allows you to adapt to the future.
Okay, which brings us to the architecture of this worldview. Because if this anti-variance mindset took over Western civilization in just one decade, it didn't happen by magic.
No, it took work.
There had to be an intellectual blueprint. How do you convince an entire civilization to pave over the wild ecosystem and plant the golf course?
Well, the author identifies 10 canonical frameworks that either emerged or achieved peak institutional dominance between 1966 and 1976. We are going to focus on 4 foundational pillars that lock together to build this present optimized worldview.
Let's do it.
And the first, perhaps the most influential in modern political philosophy, is John Rawls's Veil of Ignorance. This was published in his 1971 book, A Theory of Justice.
Okay, the veil of ignorance. For anyone listening who hasn't taken a Plisci or Philosophy 101 class recently, Rawls asks us to do a thought experiment.
Right.
Imagine you are designing a society, but you have to design it from behind a veil where you don't know who you will be in that society.
The original position.
Right. You don't know if you'll be born rich or poor, a genius or profoundly disabled, healthy or sick.
Right. And Rawls argued that any rational agent in that position, operating purely out of self-interest, would choose what he called the maximin principle.
Which means?
Meaning, you would structure society to maximize the welfare of the worst-off person, just in case that worst-off person turns out to be you.
See, I have to push back on the author's critique here because practically speaking, isn't Rawls just formalizing the golden rule?
It seems that way.
Yeah, isn't he just giving us a secular framework for basic empathy? It seems like a perfectly logical way to govern. How can the text possibly argue that this is destructive?
The text argues it is destructive because of a massive, fatal blind spot in how the veil of ignorance is applied. The author calls this temporal uncertainty.
Temporal uncertainty.
Yes. Rawls' thought experiment, and the way our institutions use it, focuses entirely on the present generation. It flattens time.
What do you mean it flattens time?
Well, if you were truly operating behind a veil of ignorance, you wouldn't just be ignorant of your social class or your physical abilities today. You would be ignorant of your place in time.
Oh.
You would know if you were going to be born in Generation 1 or Generation 10.
Okay, wow. If I don't know what century I'm born in, that changes the math completely.
Completely.
Yeah.
Because if you optimize society strictly to raise the floor for the worst off people breathing right now, you require massive resource redistribution today. You prioritize immediate consumption and safety.
Yeah, you spend everything now.
Exactly. And by doing so, you might choose policies that consume the capital, the scientific innovation, and the industrial capacity that your great-grandchildren in Generation 10 will desperately need to survive entirely different crises.
Like an asteroid strike or a pandemic or global resource depletion.
Yes.
So if I am born in Generation 10 and my ancestors in Generation 1 used Rawlsian logic to consume all our resources so nobody felt poor in the 1970s, I am going to be furious.
You'd have every right to be.
They basically ate my future to make their present comfortable.
Exactly. The author argues that Rawls' veil, as applied, creates a temporal tyranny. The present generation basically forms a cartel.
A cartel?
Yeah, because future generations cannot vote, the present votes to rob them. We systematically discount the future to make the present marginally more equal and comfortable.
That is a fascinating critique. But, practically, how can a society effectively plan for Generation 10? We can barely predict macroeconomic trends 5 years out.
Sure.
So isn't Rawls just being realistic by focusing on who is suffering right in front of us? I mean, we can actually measure present suffering. We can't measure the suffering of people who don't exist yet.
That is the exact defense often used. But the thermodynamic counterargument is that you don't need to predict exactly what Generation 10 will face.
Okay, yeah.
You just need to ensure you are leaving them a robust, high-energy, high-variance system capable of adapting to whatever they face. By optimizing purely for present equality, you're guaranteeing they inherit a depleted, low-energy system. You are robbing them of options.
Okay, I see how the temporal trap works. But if society is going to commit to this massive redistribution for the present generation, you need a justification for it.
You do.
You have to explain why some people have more and some have less in the first place. Which leads us to the second pillar of this 1970s worldview. Because if you want to justify perfectly equal outcomes today, you have to pretend humans are entirely malleable.
Yeah.
You have to introduce the blank slate.
Yes, the doctrine of the blank slate, or tabula rasa. Now, this idea goes back to John Locke, obviously, but it reached a point of absolute militant institutional enforcement in the late 1960s and 70s.
Right.
This is the belief that human differences are purely environmental and socially constructed. It actively minimizes, and in some disciplines outright denies, biological, genetic, or evolutionary constraints on human capability.
So it posits that we are all born as unwritten software, and society writes the code.
Exactly.
So if we take Rawls' demand for equality and we combine it with the blank slate, we get a very rigid, inescapable logic.
Very.
If everyone is born exactly the same, with the exact same potential, then any unequal outcomes we observe in society cannot be the result of natural variance.
Right, because natural variance doesn't exist in this framework.
Exactly. They must, by definition, be the result of systemic injustice, environmental unfairness, or malicious oppression. There is literally no other explanation allowed in that framework.
Precisely. The blank slate provides the moral fuel for the Rawlsian redistribution engine. If variance in outcomes is entirely the fault of a corrupted society, then society has an infinite moral debt to forcibly correct those outcomes.
It has to fix it.
Right. It shifts the entire focus of civilization toward auditing and correcting the present environment, rather than building for the future.
But wait, if human biology is a blank slate, what about culture? Don't different cultures produce different outcomes because they value different things or have adapted to different environments?
That is a very logical question.
That seems like a glaring hole in the theory. If we want perfect equality, we have to neutralize cultural differences too.
And that is exactly what the third pillar does. Enter cultural relativism.
Okay.
This doctrine, which also reached peak institutional dominance in this specific decade, argues that civilizational and cultural variance is essentially arbitrary.
arbitrary.
Yes, it explicitly denies that different cultural practices have different evolutionary fitness or survival value in the physical world.
So you cannot say that a culture that prioritizes written language and mathematics is better adapted for technological survival than a culture that does not.
Correct. Under strict cultural relativism, you cannot rank cultures, practices, or values because they are all just different, equally valid choices on a horizontal plane.
Even if the outcomes are vastly different.
Right. Now, historically, anthropologists use this as a tool for objective observation, which is perfectly valid. You want to observe without bias.
Right, the scientific method.
But in the 1970s, it was weaponized into a normative rule for society. If all cultural practices are equally valid, then any disparity in the success or power of different cultures must, again, be the result of oppression or historical theft.
Because it can't be variance.
Exactly. It cannot be that one set of behaviors is thermodynamically more efficient than another.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we have 3 pillars so far. We must optimize for the most vulnerable people alive right now. That's Rawls.
Yep.
We must assume all differences in individual capability are fake and caused by society. That's the blank slate.
Yes.
And we must assume all differences in cultural success are also fake and caused by oppression. That's relativism. That is a heavy, heavy mandate for equality.
It's a massive societal load.
But how do you enforce it? I mean, how do you make sure nobody breaks out of this carefully manicured golf course?
You deploy the 4th pillar. This is the one that locks the entire ideological vault, the precautionary principle.
I want to spend some real time on this because this isn't just an abstract philosophical concept. This principle became formalized law in the West starting in the 1970s, and it fundamentally changed how we interact with the physical world.
It did. The precautionary principle essentially dictates that if an action or a new technology has a suspected risk of causing severe harm to the public or the environment, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls entirely on those advocating for the action.
Which sounds reasonable at first.
It sounds totally reasonable, but in practice, it means you must minimize risk and protect against the downside, even if it means sacrificing massive civilization-altering upside.
Yeah.
You don't take a step forward until you can absolutely prove you won't trip.
Let's give a concrete example of this because it is staggering how this changed our civilization. Think about nuclear power.
Oh, the perfect example.
Yeah. In the 1950s and 60s, the West was building nuclear power plants. It was the ultimate foundry technology, high energy density, incredible long-term payoff. Sure, it had risks, but it was going to power the future. And then, in the late 60s and 70s, we adopted the precautionary principle. In the U.S., you get the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA. And suddenly, to build anything, you have to prove an absence of harm over decades.
And proving an absence of harm is mathematically impossible in a complex system.
Exactly. You can't prove a negative. So what happened? We stopped building nuclear plants. The regulatory burden became so heavy, the energy required to fight through the bureaucracy became so immense that the industry stagnated.
Completely flatlined.
We traded the massive upside of clean, virtually limitless energy for the perceived safety of not having to manage nuclear risk. And as a result, we stayed addicted to fossil fuels for another 50 years.
The precautionary principle protected the present, but materially impoverished the future.
And it's the same thing with the FDA drug approval process, right? They drastically increased their safety and efficacy requirements in the same era. We eliminated the risk of a new drug having side effects, but at the cost of delaying life-saving treatments by a decade.
Yes. And look at how perfectly these 4 pillars interlock to form a sealed loop.
Okay, let's trace it.
If the blank slate is true, unequal outcomes prove systemic injustice. If outcomes are unjust, Rawls' veil demands we immediately redistribute resources to maximize the floor today.
Okay.
If we must enforce this equality, we apply cultural relativism to ensure no behavioral variance is allowed to generate unequal success. And finally, to protect this fragile, enforced stasis, we deploy the precautionary principle to stop anyone from taking wild, asymmetrical risks that might create new inequalities.
Right, because if someone invents a new form of energy or a new biomedical enhancement, it's inherently unequal at first.
Exactly.
So we must ban or heavily regulate it under the guise of precaution.
It is an airtight worldview.
Mm-hmm.
If you accept any one of these frameworks, the logical pressure to accept the others is overwhelming.
They reinforce each other.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the author's brilliance is in not just arguing against the philosophy, but auditing the thermodynamics of this loop. When you combine these four pillars, you get a civilization that actively treats variance as an error, focuses its entire field of vision on the present, treats economics and success as a zero-sum game, and makes the elimination of risk its highest moral virtue.
Which means you are officially running the golf course.
You're running the golf course.
And these aren't just academic theories gathering dust in a university library. The author argues they share a deep psychological DNA that dictates how our entire society operates today. They share what the text calls an axiological core, a shared system of values.
Yes. The author distills this down to 7 shared features across all these 1970s frameworks.
What are they?
Well, they are universally present-focused, zero-sum in their view of resources, environmentalist in causation, meaning society causes all problems, not nature. They are anti-hierarchical, obsessively risk-minimizing, and they completely, utterly lack temporal depth. To map how this works, the source introduces a fascinating coordinate system called the SORT framework. SORT. S-O-R-T. What does that stand for? Sovereignty, organization, reality, and telos.
Okay, telos being the ancient Greek word for ultimate purpose, aim, or goal.
Exactly. And the T-axis, the telos, is the crucial one for our deep dive today. According to the physics of complex systems, a civilization can essentially optimize its overarching purpose for one of 2 directions on this axis.
Okay, what are the directions?
It can optimize for the T-positive state, which the text calls metamorphosis. This means prioritizing growth, striving, friction, acceptable risk, and a deep, multi-generational future orientation.
Building things.
Right.
Oh.
Or it can optimize for the T-negative state, which is homeostasis. This is all about preservation, stability, risk elimination, and maximizing present comfort.
And the argument is that this 1966 to 1976 package of ideas, Rawls, blank slate, relativism, precautionary principle, acted as a software update that perfectly encoded the T-negative homeostasis state into our cultural operating system.
The author gives these 2 states very evocative names to help visualize the difference. The T-positive state is called the foundry.
The foundry?
Think of an iron foundry. It's hot, it's loud, it's dangerous. People get burned. There is extreme inequality of effort and reward. There is immense friction.
But it produces something.
Exactly. A foundry is forging steel, is taking raw, unrefined material and taking a risk to build something that will outlast the builders themselves.
Right.
Society accepts the pain of risk today for the sake of compounding returns in the future.
It's the cathedral builders.
Yes.
The people who lay the foundation for a massive stone cathedral, knowing they will be dead 100 years before the final spire is placed. They are willing to suffer in the present to build the future.
Yes. Now contrast that with the T-negative state, which the author calls the hospice.
The hospice, man, that is a brutal metaphor.
It is brutal, but it is thermodynamically accurate. What is a hospice? A hospice is a place you go when you have accepted that growth is over.
Right.
The goal is no longer to cure the disease or build the body back up. The sole optimizing metric of a hospice is to manage decline as comfortably as possible.
You eliminate pain.
You eliminate pain.
Yeah.
You eliminate risk. The environment is quiet, it is safe, it is rigidly controlled, and the pain medication is administered on a strict, equal schedule. A hospice civilization externalizes all costs to the future in order to maintain a stable, painless, unburdened present.
So we are all just waiting around in comfortable beds, trying not to stub our toes.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And importantly, nothing new is being built in a hospice.
Yeah.
You are only consuming the resources that were stored up by the foundry that came before you.
You know, I want everyone listening to pause and think about how we measure progress in our society today. Think about it. What are the metrics that politicians point to?
It's all present metrics.
Right. We look at GDP growth, which is largely just a measure of consumption. We look at workplace safety metrics. We look at the elimination of risk. We throw parades when a new regulatory agency removes a 1 in a million chance of a consumer injury. But are we measuring what we are building for the year 2100?
We really aren't.
Right. We know about AI paperclip maximizers, right? The thought experiment where you tell an artificial intelligence to make paperclips and it mindlessly destroys the entire universe, harvesting atoms to make paperclips because it lacks broader context.
Right.
Well, the source argues we are essentially running a societal paperclip maximizer. But instead of an AI making paperclips, we have a vast bureaucracy mindlessly maximizing present-day comfort at the expense of everything else. Innovation, infrastructure, demographics, our own future existence.
That is the very definition of the tyranny of the present. We are consuming our own civilizational substrate, the very foundations of our society, to produce the metric of present-day comfort.
But, this raises a massive, glaring historical question. Well, for thousands of years, civilizations had to be foundries just to survive. If you
Right.
tried to be a hospice state in the year 1200, if you decided to just optimize for comfort and avoid all risk,
You die.
exactly, you starved in the winter, or you got conquered by your neighbors who were still operating as a foundry, you were wiped off the map. So why did Western civilization suddenly decide, in this very specific window of the late 1960s and early 1970s, to become a hospice? What changed in the water supply?
What changed was the environment itself. The answer lies in the completely unique historical conditions of that moment. The 1960s and 70s, particularly in America and Western Europe, represented a period of unprecedented, almost unimaginable material abundance.
Okay.
You had the post-World War II economic boom, you had the massive deployment of fossil fuels, you had the Green Revolution in agriculture. For the very first time in human history, the immediate threat of starvation, of mass freezing, of basic brutal survival was largely solved for the Western majority.
We beat the game. We pushed back the darkness.
We did. But the author argues that this abundance created a bizarre psychological whiplash because our brains didn't evolve to handle it. Think about the cultural schizophrenia of that specific era.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you had the absolute zenith, the absolute peak of the foundry mindset, the Apollo program, running from 1961 to 1972.
Putting a man on the moon.
Exactly. Apollo was the ultimate T-positive metamorphosis endeavor. It was high-risk. Astronauts literally died. It was incredibly expensive. It was heavily reliant on extreme variance, selecting only the absolute best, most elite engineers and pilots.
Yeah.
And it was aimed purely at future expansion and enlarging the human possibility space. It proved humanity could do the impossible. It was the foundry operating at maximum heat.
Right, but literally at the exact same time Apollo is happening.
At the exact same time, you had the emergence of extreme, almost apocalyptic scarcity fears regarding the Earth itself.
Oh, like the overpopulation panic?
Exactly. You had Paul Ehrlich publishing The Population Bomb in 1968, which confidently predicted that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s because we had bred too much. You had the Club of Rome publishing the Limits to Growth report in 1972, using early computer models to predict imminent global resource exhaustion and systemic collapse.
It's like the culture watched Neil Armstrong step onto the moon, looked back at the tiny blue marble of Earth, and collectively panicked.
That is exactly what happened. Society decided that the growth phase was over. The frontier was officially closed. The narrative shifted to the idea that we had reached the absolute carrying capacity of the planet.
And we had to hold on to what we had.
Right. And if the pie can no longer grow, then our only moral and practical job is to carefully, consciously manage what we have left.
Which leads to a concept the author calls the abundance paradox. And this is where the game theory of the whole situation snaps into focus. Unpack the abundance paradox for us.
The abundance paradox is the observation that extreme success removes the forcing function that prevented failure in the first place. Let's look at the basic game theory of risk.
Okay.
When a society is poor, when it is operating under brutal scarcity, taking a risk is mathematically necessary. If you are a primitive tribe and you don't take the risk of planting a new crop or exploring a new valley for game, you will starve.
Right.
The downside of taking the risk might be death. You might get eaten by a tiger in that new valley. But the downside of not taking the risk is certain death by starvation.
So you roll the dice because the baseline is 0 anyway, you have nothing to lose.
Right. But when a society becomes incredibly rich, when it achieves the abundance of the late 20th century, the math completely flips.
How so?
Well, when you have abundant food in the supermarket, centralized air conditioning, a massive welfare state, and relative peace, taking a massive civilizational risk offers diminishing marginal returns.
Oh, I see. Let's play this out. Say we want to fundamentally overhaul our energy infrastructure to go to the next level, or we want to start colonizing Mars.
Okay, what is the upside? The upside is you might get a slightly cooler, slightly more expansive future for your grandchildren. But what is the downside?
Clear.
The downside of taking that risk today threatens the massive luxurious comfort you have already built. You might disrupt the supply chains. You might cause inflation. You might have to sacrifice some present-day leisure.
The upside is marginal to me personally, but the downside is catastrophic. I could lose the Netflix, the air conditioning, and the DoorDash.
Exactly. Therefore, under conditions of abundance, safety, preservation, and risk avoidance become the mathematically rational strategy for the individual.
Even if it hurts us later?
Yes. This connects deeply to Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory, which shows that humans feel losses roughly twice as intensely as they feel equivalent gains. In a rich society, protecting what you already have is the logical neurological move, even if, and this is the tragic irony, even if that collective risk aversion mathematically dooms the civilization to stagnation and decay over the long term.
You know, we see a micro version of this all the time. This is exactly what happens to successful tech monopolies.
Oh, no.
Think about it. A company like Google or Microsoft starts out as a scrappy foundry, a few people in a garage. They're taking insane risks, they're breaking rules, they're launching weird products, trying to change the world because if they don't, they go bankrupt.
They have nothing to lose.
Right. Then they win. They achieve a monopoly. They put billions of dollars in the bank. And suddenly, over a few years, you watch their entire corporate structure mutate.
It shifts.
It's no longer pirates shipping wild new code. The company becomes bloated. They hire thousands of people in HR departments, massive legal compliance teams, trust and safety committees, and endless middle managers. And the literal only job of those thousands of people is to make sure nobody accidentally breaks the golden goose.
Right. Risk mitigation.
They stop innovating. They acquire startups just to kill them. They shift from metamorphosis to homeostasis. They just manage their own highly profitable decline.
That is a brilliant scale model of the civilizational dynamic. The transition from garage startup to bloated monopoly is exactly the transition from foundry to hospice. But what the source points out is that this isn't just a quirk of corporate economics or 1970s political theory.
It's deeper than that.
It's actually a biological bug in human neurology. Abundance didn't create the bug. Abundance just fully unleashed it by removing the environmental consequences. We are fundamentally fighting our own hardware.
Okay, let's pop the hood on this hardware bug. We are moving into section 5 of our deep dive, the mechanism. How does this tyranny of the present actually work inside the physical structure of our brains?
The author introduces a concept that behavioral economists call hyperbolic discounting.
Hyperbolic discounting.
Yes, this is a well-documented neurological phenomenon.
Yeah.
It is the human tendency to massively, irrationally overvalue immediate rewards relative to future ones. Our brains are wired to want the dopamine hit right now, and we heavily discount the value of a reward that requires waiting, even if the future reward is objectively much larger.
Oh, we all know the Stanford marshmallow experiment, right?
Exactly.
You put a toddler in a room with a marshmallow. You say, you can eat this now, or if you wait 15 minutes, I'll give you 2. And most kids just eat the one marshmallow right away. The immediate sugar hit overpowers the logical knowledge that waiting yields a 100% return on investment.
It's biology.
But what the source is doing here is elevating that toddler psychology and applying it directly to macroeconomics, global energy policy, and constitutional law. We are literally deficit spending trillions of dollars to eat the marshmallow today. We are printing money to fund present consumption, knowing full well it hollows out the currency and the purchasing power our kids will rely on. We are the toddlers in the room.
Right. The tyranny of the present is simply the marshmallow test scaled up to a civilization of billions of people. We know intellectually that investing in deep tech or maintaining tough constitutional constraints or having above replacement birth rates will yield 2 marshmallows for our grandchildren.
But we want it now.
But the political and neurological demand to eat the marshmallow right now in the form of deficit spending, immediate comfort, and risk avoidance is overwhelming. Politicians win elections by handing out marshmallows today, not by promising 2 marshmallows in 50 years.
But wait a minute, humans have always had this biological bug. We've always been primates with dopamine receptors who like sugar today. If this is hardwired into our frontal lobes, how did we ever build anything?
That's a great question.
How did we ever build the Roman aqueducts or the Gothic cathedrals or the transcontinental railroad? How did we ever plant trees knowing we'd never sit in their shade?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Historically, humanity relied on 2 distinct patches or counterpressures to override this hardware bug.
Okay.
The first patch, as we've already discussed, was scarcity. The brutal feedback loop of nature. If you eat all your seed corn in October because of hyperbolic discounting, you starve to death in February.
Oh, right.
The environment punished short-term thinking with immediate physical death. Nature was the ultimate accountability mechanism.
It forced you to defer gratification, or you died.
Yes. But the second patch was psychological. It's what the author calls mythos, our cultural, traditional, and religious narratives.
Now, I have to challenge this. We live in a secular, hyper-rational, data-driven society today. We literally have supercomputers modeling climate change 50 years out.
Yes, we do.
We have actuaries calculating pension liabilities for the year 2080. Shouldn't our unprecedented access to science, data, and predictive modeling make us significantly better at planning for the future than our medieval ancestors who relied on myths and folklore? I mean, we know the math now.
You would think so. A purely rationalist perspective assumes that more data leads to better long-term planning. But the author argues exactly the opposite, introducing a concept they brilliantly call the infinity hack.
The infinity hack.
Think about how religion and traditional mythos actually solved hyperbolic discounting in the human brain. It introduced infinite stakes.
Infinite stakes.
Yes. If you are a medieval peasant, the temptation to steal your neighbor's grain or cheat for immediate short-term gain is very high. But if your mythos tells you that the penalty for that short-term gain is eternal damnation in hell, and the reward for delayed gratification is infinite joy in heaven, the math of hyperbolic discounting breaks completely.
Oh, wow. Infinity overwhelms the discount rate.
Precisely. Faced with eternity, it actually becomes mathematically and psychologically rational for an individual to defer gratification, to suffer in the present, to build a cathedral. Mythos provided the underlying coordination software that allowed millions of consequence-blind primates to do thermodynamically expensive multi-generational work.
That makes so much sense.
But in the 1960s and 70s, at the exact same time that material abundance removed the scarcity patch, Western society underwent a massive Gnostic deconstruction of these traditional myths.
We stopped believing.
We subjected our ancient coordination software to strict scientific scrutiny, deemed it empirically false or socially outdated, and discarded it.
We deleted the software that made us care about the future.
We removed scarcity through material abundance, and we removed mythos through intellectual deconstruction. We stripped away both the physical and the psychological breaks.
Then what has?
The result was entirely predictable from a systems perspective. A civilization-wide reversion to the default primate firmware. We reverted to eating the marshmallow right now because there was no longer any immediate threat of starvation and no longer any fear of eternal consequence.
So we have this perfect storm. The intellectual frameworks of the 70s Rawls, the blank slate, the precautionary principle provide the moral justification for prioritizing the present.
Yep.
Post-WWII abundance makes it physically possible to survive doing so, at least for a while. And the loss of mythos removes the psychological brakes that used to force us to look past our own lifespans.
The trap is set.
This brings us to the ultimate question, the real so what of this entire deep dive. What actually happens to a civilization that eats all its marshmallows? What is the physical, observable consequence of this hospice operating system in the real world today? Because if the author is right, we should see the rubble.
This is where the bill comes due. The author argues that we don't have to guess what happens. We are living through the empirical evidence of this thermodynamic failure mode right now.
Right now.
It manifests not as a sudden explosion, but as three distinct interlocking crises: demographic collapse, institutional decay, and innovation dependence.
Let's start with the demographics, because the data in the source material is absolutely staggering. It's the most visceral proof of the thesis.
It is. The data clearly shows that virtually every wealthy, modernized democracy that has adopted this variance-suppressing, present-optimized worldview universally exhibits below replacement fertility.
A low replacement.
We're talking about birth rates of 1.3 to 1.8 children per woman across Europe, East Asia, and increasingly the Americas. To simply maintain a stable population, you need a replacement rate of 2.1.
Now, normally we talk about declining birth rates as a cultural shift or a consequence of women entering the workforce with a high cost of housing. But the author frames this demographic collapse not as a cultural accident, but as a direct thermodynamic outcome of the hospice state.
Right. Absolutely. Think about what reproduction actually is from an energy perspective. Having and raising children is incredibly thermodynamically expensive.
It's exhausting.
Right? It requires a massive sacrifice of present comfort, personal wealth, sleep, and energy for a future you won't fully live to see. It is the ultimate T-positive, future-oriented metamorphosis act. You are literally creating the variance of the next generation.
But if a society's entire axiological core, its very value system, is optimized for the present,
Yes.
if the highest moral good is to unburden the individual, eliminate risk, and maximize personal comfort, then having children looks like an entirely irrational lifestyle choice.
It looks like a threat to your personal homeostasis.
Wow.
A hospice society views reproduction not as a civilizational imperative, but as a costly, risky hobby that interrupts your consumption.
That is a chilling way to frame it. but it perfectly aligns with the logic of the tyranny of the present. Why would I sacrifice my comfort today, my ability to travel, my disposable income, for a generation that doesn't exist yet? Under the Rawlsian framework, I only have an obligation to the present.
And this demographic collapse cascades into institutional decay. This ties back to the illusion of sudden collapse we discussed at the very beginning of the show.
Right, the earthquake.
Right. From the inside, civilizational decay looks sudden when the final crisis hits, like a currency hyperinflating or a supply chain breaking. But the author emphasizes that the collapse is actually the slow, invisible depletion of capital stocks over decades.
And capital stocks doesn't just mean money in a bank.
Not at all. It means demographic capital. The sheer number of young, energetic people required to drive a society, care for the elderly, and invent new things. It means institutional trust. It means the competence of the bureaucracy. It means the literal physical infrastructure like bridges and power grids.
We are burning our civilizational furniture to keep the house warm today. We defer maintenance on the bridge to fund a tax cut or a stimulus check today.
Exactly.
And the darkest part of this analysis is that we often label this burning of furniture as compassion or equality. We borrow trillions of dollars to fund present-day consumption, we run massive deficits, and we frame it as taking care of the vulnerable. But in reality, we are condemning our descendants to freeze in the dark because we used up all their fuel and saddled them with the debt.
The author specifically points to this dynamic as temporal parasitism. The democratic ratchet ensures that politicians who promise immediate present benefits will almost always outcompete politicians who demand present sacrifice for future stability. The system is structurally designed to consume the future.
So if the physics of the universe demand variance, if they demand friction and future investment to survive, are we just trapped?
It feels that way.
Does the author believe we are locked into this hospice state until the demographic pyramid flips over entirely and the house collapses? Because this sounds incredibly deterministic.
The author's conclusion is sobering, but it's not completely deterministic. The trap is powerful because, as we discussed, it is the path of least biological resistance when combined with abundance. But the escape route exists.
Okay, good.
It requires a massive act of collective willpower. It requires engineering what the text calls new forcing functions.
What does a forcing function look like in practice? How do we build that?
It means we cannot rely on human nature or goodwill to overcome the abundance paradox. If you give a primate a comfortable couch and unlimited food, it will sit on the couch.
Of course.
We have to build constitutional architectures, legal, institutional, and cultural frameworks that artificially maintain the pressure to grow, to explore, and to take risks, even when our abundant environment makes it tempting to just relax.
Like artificial scarcity, almost.
In a way, yes. We have to actively separate the people deciding our long-term civilizational goals from the short-term electoral feedback loop. We need rigid rules against temporal parasitism, like strictly limiting deficit spending or tying voting power or societal rewards to long-term stakes, like having children or building durable infrastructure.
So we force ourselves to look at Generation 10.
Exactly. The author says we have to consciously, deliberately build a new foundry before the hospice goes completely bankrupt.
We essentially have to write the code that forces us to be brave, because left to our own devices on a full stomach, without the fear of hell or the fear of starvation, we will always choose the couch.
Precisely. It is an engineering problem now, not just a moral failing. We have to engineer a system that artificially induces the T-positive state.
Okay, let's step back and recap this incredible journey for you listening, because we have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at how a package of seemingly benevolent, compassionate frameworks from the 1970s, Rawls' veil of ignorance, the blank slate, cultural relativism, and the precautionary principle coalesced into a cohesive worldview that actively denies variance and eliminates risk.
And we saw how the unprecedented material abundance of the modern era, combined with the loss of our traditional mythic time horizons, unleashed our worst short-term instincts at a civilizational scale.
We scaled up the marshmallow test to the size of the global economy.
Exactly. And we explored how this has trapped us in a comfortable but mathematically terminal demographic and institutional decline in the hospice state.
The central takeaway is that the tyranny of the present isn't some grand, shadowy political conspiracy. It's much more terrifying than that.
It's thermodynamic drift.
Right. It is the natural gravity of a successful society that has lost its forward momentum and is slowly running out of energy. And once you see this framework, you will interact with it every single day.
You won't be able to unsee it.
Every time you see a tech company prioritize massive legal compliance over shipping a genuine breakthrough, or every time a government policy sacrifices long-term fiscal sustainability to mail out a quick stimulus check for today's voters, you aren't just seeing politics. You are watching the tyranny of the present operating in real time.
You're watching the marshmallow being eaten.
Exactly. I want to leave you with a final unmentioned thought inspired by this deep dive. Think about the modern concept of retirement.
Oh, that's interesting.
We are taught from a very young age that the ultimate goal of a successful life is to work just hard enough so that one day, usually around 65, you can completely stop producing, kick back on a beach somewhere, and just consume resources until you die. That is the dream we are sold.
It is the ultimate hospice state.
What if that personal dream of retirement is exactly what our entire civilization is doing right now? What if we decided collectively in the 1970s that humanity had worked hard enough, that we had built enough, and it was time for Western civilization to retire into a managed state of consumption?
That is a profound thought.
And if that is true, what if the ultimate rebellion against the tyranny of the present isn't some grand political movement or electing a new politician? What if the ultimate rebellion is simply choosing in your own life to never retire your curiosity, your drive, and your willingness to build for a future you might not even live to see? To lay a stone for a cathedral you will never see finished. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.